Hello. I am very delighted to be here. I am Poetic Heretic, and today we are indeed continuing our Seth/Jane Roberts series, analyzing the unknown reality. Now, this might be a shorter stream than usual, but we will get as far as we can. I'm just making sure we have the session loaded. We'll be beginning with session 685. So as usual, I'll be reading and commenting on the material, as well as taking any comments or questions that pop up about it. Those are not that common with these streams, though. And I ask everyone to remember that this is an analysis of the book. It is not our sitting here just believing it, and it is not our sitting here just reading it the entire time. Okay, we're sounding good. So if you're looking for someone who's just reading it the entire time, you might want to look elsewhere. Furthermore, if you're expecting this to be fast-paced, you might want to look elsewhere. My streams are meant to be kind of relaxed and easy-paced. You can just enjoy the material as it comes. So when we last left off, we're already I think about 1/3 through Volume 1 of The Unknown Reality. So let's see here. Vengeance. The Unknown Reality. Yes, if anyone is wondering what happened to me on Saturday, you see there was a storm and it prevented me from showering, so I actually had no real way of getting ready for the stream. And so basically I had to cancel the stream. And so now that that tarot stream for the Four of Wands is just going to have to wait until, I guess, this Saturday, unless I can somehow squeeze it in sooner. I don't know. We'll have to see. But yeah, right as I was about to get ready to go live, I was going to go shower and everything, there was a storm, and I couldn't just safely shower with all of that lightning about. So I tweeted about it, but I don't know how many people saw that. Which, on that note, if you guys are ever wondering where I am or whatever, I mean, I don't always post updates with what's going on to Twitter, but I do frequently. So poetic_heretic on Twitter. You can check that out if you want. And you don't even have to have a Twitter account actually to look at that. You can just go to twitter.com/poetic_heretic. It's not like I have it private or anything. Why would I? All right, so without further ado, I think this lighting is good, but let me just see what happens if we do this. It's maybe a little more stable now. No, I think we'll go with this. So without further ado, let us begin. Session 685, February 25th, 1974, 9:51 p.m., Monday. When Jane lay down for a nap late this afternoon, she had quite an unusual experience. From her notes, quote, "Just before I went to sleep, I had a sort of mental projection that seemed to be into the past, my past. I was a baby in my hometown, Saratoga Springs, New York. The time was about 1931 to start with. Everything was misty, gray, without color. First, quote-unquote, I looked down on, quote-unquote, myself in my carriage. Then, I moved through the streets easily enough as I got, quote-unquote, older during the projection. Wait, just now as I wrote this, I picked up something, brackets, from a part of my consciousness other than Rupert or Seth. To the effect that the projection environment is as focused as mine is, really, but that it's a probability of mine. Biologically, I wasn't keyed into it in my quote-unquote now. I was in it and not in it, between focused realities, traveling in or through these fluctuations of consciousness Seth talked about in the last session. He mentioned probable kinds of consciousness in that session too. Was I trying to develop one of those here in my own physical reality? But this was definitely a waking event taking place just before my nap. I described the whole thing to Rob as soon as I got up. We'd waited for tonight's session since 9:26. As we sat talking desultorily, Jane grew more and more impatient. Once again, as she had before the 684th session and on other occasions, she said that now, quote, something was different, end quote, in the sessions. For this book, she had to, quote unquote, get a certain clear focus. Just going to scoot my chair a bit. Okay. Good evening. Good evening, Seth. Now, give us a moment. Body is also pattern, period. While the material that composes it changes constantly, the pattern maintains its own integrity. The form is etched in space and time, and yet the pattern itself exists outside of that framework also. The body is a projection, therefore, into the three-dimensional field. The consciousness of the cells within it, however, are eternal. The physical framework, then, is itself composed of immortal stuff. The projection in time and space may disappear, in your terms, wither and die. The main identity continues to exist, even as the consciousness of millions of cells still exists that at one time were part of the body. A 1-minute pause at 9:59. While inhabited by the usual human consciousness, the living body operates as an intense focus point. The conglomeration of consciousness within it on all levels focuses its own network of communication. This private network is connected to all others like it. There are levels of interaction then simply between all bodies, electromagnetically and biologically. The network is more far-reaching than that, however. Not only can all cells respond to each other, but their mass activity triggers even higher centers of consciousness to respond to a underlined given set of world conditions, rather than to other quite as legitimate world conditions that do not fit the accepted pattern. Probabilities underlined to some extent, then, are determined along cellular lines. This should be obvious. A long pause, one of many, at 10:07. The body's very structure will in itself set patterns for the kinds of probabilities that can be practically experienced. The source reality out of which all else springs is never predetermined, that is, predestined, or even set. The universe in any terms is always being created, period. When consciousness is being specified, it always sees itself at the center of its world. All specifications of consciousness and all phenomenal appearances occur when the basic units of consciousness, the CUs, emerge into EE units, and hence into the dimensions of actuality in your terms. Your mainly accepted normal consciousness is within the matter of your body, and through it, the body, you view your world. There is nothing to prevent you from viewing your body from a standpoint outside of it, except that you have been taught that consciousness is imprisoned within the flesh. The body is a sending and receiving organism, your home station, so to speak, and the focus for your activity. You can, however, quite consciously leap from it, and you do often, when for a while, particularly in the dream state, you view the world from another perspective. So, in case anyone is forgetting, Seth's CUs, those refer to consciousness units or units of consciousness, and EE units refer to electromagnetic energy units. And these are connected in the formation of matter, according to Seth's thesis. Give us a moment. In some adventures, you do visit other probable realities in which you have a body structure quite as real as, quote unquote, your own. Your own psychological makeup, for that matter, achieves its marvelous complexity because it draws from the rich bank of your greater probable existences. Even a small understanding of these ideas can help you glimpse how limiting previous concepts of psychology have been. A 1-minute pause at 10:25. The self that you know and recognize carries within it hints and traces of all of your probable characteristics that, underlined, can be actualized within your system of reality. Your body is equipped to bring any of these to fulfillment. Now, because of the selectivity mentioned earlier, certain directions may be easier than others, and some may appear impossible. Footnote. Seth discusses selectivity in the 682nd session at 10:36. End of footnote. And the stream containing that is up on my channel if anyone wants to follow that up. Yet within the psychological and biological structure of your species, the roads of probabilities have more intersections than you know. The conscious mind, as you normally think of it, directs your overall action, and its ideas determine the kind of selectivity you use. It is for this reason that I am trying to expand your conscious ideas, so that you become better equipped to choose your line of physical experience from all those probable ones open to you. Now take your break. 10:32. I thought Jane's trance had been a good one, even though she'd used many pauses, but she told me that she hadn't been at her best, nor had she been aware of her slow delivery. She also felt that we'd eaten supper, brackets at 7:30, too close to session time. I discussed with Jane the questions I'd thought of when Seth had commented above on, quote, how limiting previous concepts of psychology have been, end quote. As a discipline, why was psychology so narrowly developed? Why hadn't it continued expanding until it encompassed ideas like those Jane was delivering tonight, for instance? Her work was unique in that it was coming through her individual personality, I added. Yet, why wasn't the theory of probabilities, or its equivalent, say, common knowledge, or at least considered, in psychology today? I asked if Seth cared to comment. After we talked for a few more minutes, Jane said, I've got the feeling you're going to get answers to your questions about psychology, but they'll be presented as the preface to this book. We hadn't given the idea of a preface a thought. Making a joke, I asked Jane what was coming up next in the session. I meant generally, but she replied, the preface. Even then, I don't think either of us expected Seth to carry out such a project tonight, but as he came through at 10:57, now, preface. There is an unknown reality, in quotes as given. I am part of it, and so are you. Parentheses, Seth finished at midnight. Jovially, underlined, end of preface. Parentheses, okay. End of session. Parentheses, all right. Thank you, Seth. Good night. I said at 12:01 a.m., and Seth was gone almost at once. See the preface at the beginning of this book. Jane said that although Seth hadn't actually considered my specific questions about psychology after all, they had served as an impetus for the preface. She felt good. I read the preface to her, and she felt even better. Although the session ostensibly ended here, there were actually several succeeding and continuing effects that grew out of it. Jane's Saratoga experiences involved too. All of the relevant material is given in detail in Appendix 4. And that does indeed conclude the session. All right. According to the Kindle app, the next one will take about 39 minutes to read, so that should be good. That's about the amount of time I have left here. Session 686, February 27th, 1974, 9:45 p.m., Wednesday. The effects continued to flow out of last Monday night's session. Jane was very intrigued by the material she produced, quote-unquote, on her own after the session, both in the sleep state that night and in the statements she wrote for the next day. See Appendix 4. As we made ready for tonight's session at 9:10 and discussed the information she'd received, she began to feel a continuation of the experience. This time, however, it came through verbally as dictation, although Seth wasn't involved. I made notes on most of what she had to say. It's presented as Appendix 5, and I suggest that the reader review it before continuing with this session. Well, if Rob suggests that, and there's a convenient link here to it, we might as well go right to it. All right, let's see here. Appendix 5 for session 686. This appendix is an extension of the opening notes for the 686th session. 9:10 p.m. Jane began her own dictation before tonight's session by saying that as she typed her statements yesterday for Appendix 4, she would, quote-unquote, get glimpses of some of the concepts Seth was going to talk about in unknown reality, yet they would immediately vanish from her consciousness, so that all she had left was the knowledge that she'd experienced the insight. She started coming through with her material as soon as we sat for the session, so it took me a few moments to get my pen and notebook ready. But from here on, I was able to take notes on most of what she said, so the following is pretty close to a verbatim report. Now, I'm getting ideas from so many places at once, so fast that I can't express them all. I need you to coach me to ask what's happening now, to keep me focused on one channel. Because our mental habits automatically block out such material, we only recognize one series of neurological happenings. It takes time for the message to leap the nerve endings, brackets, the synapses. We just recognize one speed. Other messages leap too fast or too slow for us to focus upon them. By altering our consciousness in the way I'm learning to do now, though, we can line up our focuses with these other quote-unquote ghostly messages that are quite as real as the neurological validity we usually accept. Need some more water. By now, Jane was dictating steadily, almost as she does when speaking for Seth. Quote, now everything I just said came in a flash while I was waiting for you to write down what you just wrote, but what I got originally was like a ball of string, so that as I explained it, the string unraveled into the words. I had all kinds of sudden flashes about this when I was doing the dishes, parentheses, less than half an hour ago, about Seth's book, and that in a strange way it was difficult for me to get this book material. It was new, maybe. It would involve concepts that by themselves went against the grain of usual conscious thought, which wants to go consecutively. It's as though my consciousness is trying to use a new kind of organization, for me, for it. And so there's a kind of unfamiliarity. No scientific language would be used, not that I know any, but that would structure what I'm trying to do, and unwittingly, perhaps, it might lead me into a scientific dogma without recognizing it. Besides, that would put an unnecessary burden on the reader, who might feel he or she needed a particular vocabulary. The use of a normal vocabulary would put the ideas within the reach of the ordinary person as much as possible. Although most people might need to work at it to understand the material, there'd be no automatic difficulties with words. 9:24. Now, while giving all of that, I'm in some kind of altered state of consciousness that I can't quite identify. What's so strange about it, I guess, is that I don't seem able to verbally put my fingers on it. Parentheses, Jane laughed, scrambling her syntax. I can't pick it up, and for that reason, it can get quite exasperating when I talk about it. I feel, though, that all of this is part of tonight's session. Parentheses, she laughed again. I also have an awful feeling that I'm going to get some kind of instructions from Seth about what I'm to do physically in order to get this material, and so compensate for this new way of receiving things. But don't put that in the notes. But clearly Rob did. I almost feel that if you asked me at any time of the day, Jane, what are you getting at now, that I could tune into any of these areas of information and tell you. As the messages leap the nerve ends, they form certain pulses. We recognize these as messages and ignore all the others. I feel as though I'm learning to jump in between the recognized pulses and pick up usually inaccessible ones. Trying to make all this verbal is very difficult. Parentheses, once new developments in Jane's psychic abilities begin to show themselves, one can start backtracking to find possible origins. I'd say that her own awareness of multiple channels has grown out of her initial sensing of the channels available from Seth, as described in the 616th session in Chapter 2 of Personal Reality, and that her material on neurological speeds is related to the observations of Jane that were noted by Sue Watkins in Seth Speaks. See the 594th session in the appendix of that book. I also think that a thorough search of earlier sessions would turn up many other clues, foreshadowing both eventualities. I'd like to add here that the flood of material issuing from Jane lately, both in and out of trance, has been extraordinary, and I note that as one who is used to her strong bursts of creative activity. There seems to be no end to it. She's also been very active in her ESP class this month, with extensive singing in Sumari, which is her own musical trance language, and with long sessions via Seth in each class. The transcripts of some of the latter have run to 5 or 6 single-spaced typewritten pages. It takes physical time and great physical energy to deliver all of that material. And there is a footnote/note, and it says, much Sumari material can be found in Chapter 7 of Jane's Adventures, and in the appendix of her novel, The Education of Oversoul 7. End of footnote. And that is also the end of Appendix 5. So now, returning to session 686, we can proceed. It was 9:40 by the time Jane finished her dictation. She sat quietly for a few moments. Quote, now I'm just waiting for Seth, she told me. Then, it's as though I feel a lot of concepts around me right now, and I'm letting him get them organized for me. But now I think I'm about ready. Softly, good evening. Good evening, Seth. Now, basically, the cell's comprehension straddles time as you think of it. Period. Mankind's consciousness, however, experimented along time-specific lines. As he developed underlined along those lines, various biological and mental methods of selectivity and discrimination were utilized. When, in historic terms, mankind became aware of memory and recalled his past as a past in your terms, it was possible for him to confuse past and present. Vivid memories, out of context but given immediate neurological validity, could compete with the brilliant focus necessary in his present. Footnote. Once again, I suggested the same reference in Note 2 for Session 683. See Session 647 through 48 in Chapter 12 of Personal Reality. End of footnote. Though the past underlined is actually quite as immediate, alive, and creative as the present is, man made certain adjustments on several layers that would focus definite distinctions and set past and present experience apart. While your particular kind of consciousness was developing, it began to intensify selectivity, to concentrate specifically in a small area of activity while blocking out other data. This was necessary because the particular kind of physical manipulation of corporal existence required instant physical response to immediately present stimuli. 955. Such selectivity and specialization therefore represented a pertinent method as consciousness familiarized itself with earthly experience. Hunters had to respond at once to the present situation. In time terms, the quote-unquote present animal had to be killed for food, not the quote-unquote past animal. Underlined, that animal, the past one, existed as surely as the one presently perceived, yet in man's context, physical action had to be directed to a highly specific area, for physical survival depended upon it. Pause, and slowly. The cell's basic innocence of time discrimination had to be bypassed. At deeply unconscious levels, the neurological structure is more highly adaptable than it appears. Adjustments were made, therefore. Basically, the neurological structure responds to both past and future data. Biologically, then, such activity is built in. The specialized quote-unquote new kind of consciousness in one body had to respond pinpoint fast. Therefore, it focused upon only one series of neurological messages. Parentheses, as Seth, Jane was enunciating the material very carefully, almost syllable by syllable, as though to give me time to write down without error. Her diction in trance is usually excellent, though it's not often that I have to ask her to repeat a word or phrase. These became more and more biologically prominent, so that man's consciousness underlined rode them or leaped upon them. These particular pulses or messages became the biologically and mentally accepted ones. They were clued into sense perception, then. These pulses or messages became the only underlined official data that, translated into sense perception, formed physical reality. This selectivity gave an understandable line of reference from interior to exterior existence. 1010. Deliberately but intently. Other quite as valid messages were ignored. They became, while present, biologically underlined invisible. The cells still reacted to these otherwise neglected pulses, as they needed data from both the past and future to maintain the body's balance in, quote-unquote, the present. The necessity for immediate underlined conscious exterior action at a quote-unquote definite point of underlined intersection with events was left to the emerging ego consciousness. While the cells required future and past data and used it to form from that invisible tension the body's present corporal reality, the same kind of information could be a threat underlined then to the ego consciousness, which could be overwhelmed. Within the corporal structure, however, there are indeed messages that leap too quickly or too slowly from your viewpoint to allow for any physical response. In that way, wait one moment, there is a footnote. I almost skipped over it. Footnote. See Jane's own material in Appendix 5. However, while studying Seth in this session, as well as the notes presented during break at 11:26, it's a good idea for the reader to keep both Appendixes 4 and 5 in mind. End of footnote. I can see my plants from here, and they are getting plenty of sun. Awesome. I bet that makes them, well, very happy after a series of cloudy days. So, all right, here we go. In that way, cellular comprehension is allowed its free flow, but the selectivity mentioned, parentheses in session 682 to 683, underlined bypasses such information, so that it does not conflict with present sense data requiring physical action in time. Other pulses carrying messages are quite as valid as those that you perceive and physically react to. Again, the cells respond to those constantly. The body, as mentioned in the 685th session, is an electromagnetic pattern poised in a web of probabilities, experienced as corporal at an intersection point in space and time. When man, speaking in your terms of history, began to experiment with memory, there were innumerable instances where the emerging ego consciousness did not distinguish clearly enough between the past and present as you understand them. The past, underlined in the present, would appear so brilliantly that man could not react adequately in circumstances of time that he had himself created. The future was blocked, practically speaking, long pause, to preserve freedom of action and to encourage physical exploration, curiosity, and creativity. So isn't it interesting here what Seth is saying? It almost implies that perhaps man's state of consciousness at this particular time was maybe much more dreamlike, or that would be a theory anyway, much more dreamlike. And so the past, when it would appear in one's mind or whatever, would indeed appear very vivid, with a present that perhaps was more dreamlike. At least, I don't know, I'm sort of speculating here, but that may be what Seth is ultimately saying. With memory, however, mental underlined projections into the future were of course also possible, so that man could plan his activities in time and foresee probable results. quote unquote ghost images of the future probabilities always acted as mental stimuli for physical explorations in all areas and of all kinds. Parentheses, quote, do you mean in all areas of the planet, for instance? These ghost images provided stimuli for mental, spiritual, underlined, and physical experience. That answers your question, I believe. Parentheses, yes. So wait a minute. So what is Seth saying here exactly? So these ghost images provided stimuli for mental, spiritual, and physical experience. So indeed, it would be all areas of the planet. Huh. Interesting. The race was dealing with the creation of a new world of physical experience. To do this particular kind of experiment, it was necessary that physical manipulation be concentrated upon. Ghost images from the future were one thing, inspiring mankind. Had such data instantly appeared before him, however, man would have been deprived of the physical joys, endeavors, and challenges that were so underlined basic to the experiment itself. Do you want to rest your hand? Parentheses, I shook my head. No. Jane had been speaking for Seth for 3/4 of an hour and showed no real inclination to stop. As in the other sessions of this book, I was aware of an extra charge or impetus, an added determination on Seth Jane's part. Now in trance, Jane was going through these complicated sentences without trouble, even indicating punctuation. End of parentheses. It would have been quite possible for you as a race to have chosen any other quote unquote series of neurological pulses or messages as the quote unquote real ones, and to structure your experience along different lines. This lighting is suddenly all messed up. Let me see if I can fix that. Must be because the sunlight is hitting the webcam directly. Let's see. Oh yeah, that fixes it immediately. Okay, well, I apologize for the interruption, but I guess I'll need to shut the blinds real quick. There we go. Oh well, like I said, it makes my succulents happy, all this sunlight, so I'm happy for them. Okay, much better. So continuing. The biological structure and the mental consciousness together, however, chose the most comfortable sequence in which a present area of activity brought about by neurological recognition would be backed up by unconscious mental knowledge and other biologically invisible neurological connections. The psyche knows itself and is aware of its part. When ego consciousness reached a certain point of biological and mental competence, when experience in the present became extensive enough, then ego consciousness would be at the stage where it could begin to accept greater data. Indeed, it is now at that stage. My freaking eye is itchy. So that's interesting. So the ego consciousness would be at the stage where it could begin to accept greater data, and indeed it is now at that stage. So consider the implications of that. So again, the psyche knows itself and is aware of its parts. When ego consciousness reached a certain point of biological and mental competence, when experience in the present became extensive enough, then ego consciousness would be at the stage where it could begin to accept greater data. A certain point of biological and mental competence, when experience in the present became extensive enough. Isn't that fascinating? Pause at 1037. Its focus in the present is now secure. Underlined, that focus finally brought about, in your terms, an expansion of consciousness, and one that early man did not have to handle. In your terms, time now includes more space, and hence more experience and stimuli. Again, speaking historically, in the past, the private person in any given hour was aware at once only of those events happening in his immediate environment. He could respond instantly. Events were underlined to that extent now manageable. And rest your hand if you want to. Parentheses, I felt all right, but Jane, still in trance, held up her empty cigarette pack. She waited quietly while I got her a fresh one. The ego specialized in expansions of space and its physical manipulation. It specialized with objects. As a result, now, a person in any given hour is aware of events happening at the other end of the world. No immediate physical response he or she can make seems adequate or pertinent on many occasions. Bodily physical action, then, underlined to that extent, loses its immaculate precision in time. You cannot kick an enemy, and that's enemy in quotes, who does not live in your village or country. An enemy, furthermore, whom you do not even know personally. Parentheses, intently. Again, to that extent, instant physical action in time is not the same kind of life and death factor that it was when a man was faced with an enraged animal or enemy in close combat. Parentheses, can I ask a question? As Seth, Jane nodded. Will you give us a definition of what you mean by early man? I think readers would be interested. I'd been hoping Seth would go into this. Still in trance, Jane nodded again when I had finished, and I had the distinct impression that I shouldn't have interrupted her delivery. Now, in the past, in the same way, love could be immediately expressed. In historic terms, early man, using here your theories about the race, early man, was in intimate contact with his family clan, with his family, clan, or tribe. With the developing expansion of space, however, loved ones often dwell far apart, and sudden bodily response cannot be expressed at once, at a particular point of immediate contact. 1057. These developments with others are already triggering changes in man's behavior and inspiring him toward further alterations of consciousness. He now needs a more expansive viewpoint of past and future in order to help him deal with the ramifications of the present as it has evolved through experience. Recognized concepts of the self are the ego's interpretation of selfhood. They are projected into concepts of God and the universe. They meet with a certain biological validity because of the selectivity earlier mentioned, whereby only one series of neurological pulses is accepted, and upon these rides the reality of the egotistical self. At one quote-unquote time, a God interpreted in those terms served as a model for the egotistical behavior of oneself toward another self. Parentheses, I read the last paragraph back to Seth to check it. I had it down all right. I hadn't lost my way after all. Slowly. In a world in which individuals were confined in space in a tribe or clan, a 1-minute pause. Action was immediate. The environment presented a framework in which consciousness learned to deal with stimuli in a direct fashion. It learned how to focus. The necessary specialization meant that only so much data could be handled at once, emotionally or otherwise. The formation of different tribes allowed man to behave cooperatively, in small numbers. This meant that those on the underlined outside were selectively ignored, considered strangers. Intently. At that underlined point, consciousness in those terms could not handle focused concentration, the emergence of ego consciousness, and simultaneously experience powerful feelings of oneness with other large groups. It was struggling for individuation. Individuation, however, was dependent upon the cooperation of individuals. As the ego learned to feel more secure, the cooperative tendencies broadened so that the growth of nations was possible. It was inevitable, however, that ego consciousness would produce a reality in which it would finally need, in those terms, to accept other data and information that in the beginning it had to ignore. I am speaking so far in historic terms, as you understand them. History, however, is but your official line of accepted stimuli. Later in the book, that will be made clear. New paragraph, parentheses, and more rapidly. As egotistical consciousness expands to include hereto largely neglected data, then it will experience, practically speaking, a new kind of identity, knowing itself differently. Its concepts of godhood will significantly alter, as will the dimensions of emotion. Your heritage includes vastly richer veins of love, yet your concepts of self and godhood have severely limited these. You often seem to hate those with different beliefs than your own, for example, and you have perpetrated cruelties upon others in the name of religion and in the name of science, because your limited ideas about the nature of the self led you to fear your emotions. Often you are afraid that love will overwhelm you, for instance. A 1-minute pause at 11:20. While you were so concerned with protecting what you thought of as the boundaries and integrity of one's selfhood, as a race you actually arrived at a point where you were beginning to deny your own greater reality. But all of this is part of the experiment upon which the race embarked and underlined your probability. Where your physical survival, in those terms, once depended upon a narrowed focus while you learned physical manipulation, now the success of that manipulation necessitates a broadening of focus. Man, I keep making all these mistakes. I'm just going to do that sentence over again. Where your physical survival, in those terms, once depended upon a narrowed focus while you learned physical manipulation, now the success of that manipulation necessitates a broadening of focus, a new awakening into the larger existence of the selfhood, with what will be a corresponding re-recognition of neurological activity that is now only briefly sensed by some, parentheses, like Jane, but present in the heritage of your corporal structure. That's interesting. So in other words, I think what Seth is saying here is, whereas once our focus had to be very narrowed for the purposes of survival and whatnot, now, let's see, how does Seth put it? Now the success of that manipulation necessitates a broadening of focus. Yeah, now, instead of having that narrowed focus, now we need to broaden our focus, in other words. And Seth, again, goes on to call that a new awakening into the larger existence of the selfhood, with what will be a corresponding re-recognition of neurological activity that is now only briefly sensed by some, like Jane, but present in the heritage of your corporal structure. Louder. Now, I do not think you can reasonably be expected to take any more notes without a break, and so I give you one. Parentheses, okay, thank you. All right, so getting kind of close to the end of the session, I think. My voice really needs a lot of water today for some reason. So that's why I keep drinking it. So I wonder if we could use some more light. No, I think this is still better. It's confusing when the sun is I don't know, constantly shifting and changing its patterns and whatever. Or not changing its patterns, but constantly shifting in here, the lighting as the sun goes down. 11:26. Actually, this was one of those times when it seemed that I could have continued note-taking indefinitely. Seth and Jane certainly appeared able to keep going. Jane had been in trance for an hour and 41 minutes, but even so, she was out of it rapidly. Quote, "The trances have changed since you started this book, though," she said. "Once I get on the right track, Seth just keeps going, and I don't want to change it or get off. I think it's a great development, but if you think you're onto something no one else has, you're afraid you'll be called batty by the rest of the world. Seth is a great organizer, though. It's like there's a tremendous amount of work being done behind the sessions so I can get the data. But this isn't like the channels from Seth, brackets as described in the 616th session in Chapter 2 of Personal Reality, end of brackets, end quote. Jane said that I might better ask questions only during break, at least for now. My inquiry about early man hadn't, quote unquote, seriously disturbed her, but I'd been correct in feeling that I shouldn't have interrupted her then. She also talked about possible confusions or conflicts between Seth doing Unknown Reality while she was writing her own Adventures in Consciousness. She'd had no trouble, however, and is still enthusiastic about her book. She's putting Chapter 4 into final form. Adventures is due at her publishers, Prentice Hall Incorporated, in September 1974. Resume in a quiet manner at 11:48. Now, here and throughout this book, there will be sections dealing with practice elements in capitals, where to some extent you can see how certain of these concepts can be practically experienced and receive at least a hint of their application. Centered with gestures. Practice element 1, and this is indeed centered and in bold text and in all capitals and sort of set aside in the page with a space, then practice element 1, then another space. So, practice element 1. In a waking state, Rupert found himself in Saratoga Springs, New York, where he grew up, in what seemed to be a kind of mental projection. Parentheses, see Jane's notes at the beginning of the last session. Everything was gray. The immediate nature of full blast sense data was missing. Vision was clear but spotty, highly selective. Motion was, however, the strongest sense element. Rupert was bodiless on the one hand, and on the other he perceived some of the experience through the eyes of an infant in a carriage. Quite sharply he perceived a underlined particular curb at the corner of a definite intersection. Parentheses, York Avenue and Warren Street, and his attention was caught by the focus a curb, a slope of dirt, and then the sidewalk, and the motion of the carriage as it was wheeled up. The child was himself in the past on the one hand, and yet he was a underlined probable future self in that past. Pause. From the standpoint of Rupert's official mental focus, and from the standpoint of the neurologically accepted present, that past environment had to remain off-center or blurred. He could experience it only by sidestepping officially accepted neurological activity. He visited a store that is not at that location, quote unquote, anymore. And here the sense data were somewhat clearer. He had no conscious memories of the store's interior, yet it was instantly apparent to him. The dark oiled floor, spread with sawdust. Even the odors were present. He toured his, public, grade school where he attended kindergarten to third grade, saw the children come out for recess, and felt himself one of them, while during the entire experience he knew himself as an adult, embarked upon that adventure. Footnote. See the 679th session at something 4. I don't know if this is an error in the book or what. I guess it must be, but I don't know if that's supposed to say I don't know. It just says see the 679th session at, and then there's a superscript with the number 4, and then it says as well as note 4 itself. So whatever. End of footnote. He went from place to place, floating bodiless, a tour of consciousness. That same environment exists underlined now, alternately with Rupert's present, and as vividly as his present does. It was, however, from his viewpoint, a probable past. This is strange because it reminds me of a dream I had just a couple nights ago, just the other night. Where it was like in the dream, I was well, it was like I was much younger again, like a seventh grader, like 12 years old, I think. And I was like sort of outside and nearby my old school, like my middle school / high school, which the buildings were connected. And I was walking with I guess some other school kids, and it was weird though because it was like I had the conscious awareness in this dream that I was younger again, you know, like I had a sense in that moment in a dream that in my physical reality I'm an adult, but now in my dream it's like, oh, I'm like 12 years old again, or I'm a seventh grader again. And furthermore, it actually got a lot weirder for me because soon after this, I was interacting with some people, and I suddenly became like acutely aware that I was dreaming, but not just that I was dreaming, because I've had dreams like that, I don't know how many times, but that like my physical body was currently asleep, and my dream was just like resting on the bed of my physical body, if that makes sense. It was resting on the integrity and stability of my physical body. Like I knew in my dream that I was dreaming and that my physical body was currently asleep. And it was so freaky. I can't really explain it or describe it properly. But not only that, but I was interacting with, I think, 2 other people, and one of them claimed to be from the year 2012. And I was even explaining some things to the person from 2012 about the current year of 2019. And I think the other person might have been from the year like 2004, 2003, maybe 2002. I don't know, probably like 2003. Which, there I was 2019, and there were 2 other people, each one from different times. And when I woke up, it felt so freaking weird because it almost felt like that dream really happened. It almost felt like I really did somehow meet with other people from other times and communicate with them. But of course, it could have just been a dream. But I don't know what Seth is describing here reminded me of that. So I thought I would throw that out there. But yeah, I can't describe how weird of a feeling it was to like realize in my dream that not only was I dreaming, but that my physical body was asleep, and that I was like, I thought, well, geez, like I don't even have control over my physical body right now. Like, what if, I don't know, like what if I was in an awkward position, or what if my physical body was in pain or something, that kind of thing. I started thinking of that. But then I also got the sense that if I really wanted to, I could wake myself up at any moment if I willed it strongly enough, which I didn't need to do, but that was then reassuring. But anyway, so there is now, after Seth said it was, however, from his viewpoint, a probable past, A footnote. In Seth Speaks alone, there is much material on probabilities that I could cite in connection with this session. One of my favorite sessions, however, is the 566 in chapter 16, where Seth discusses the quote-unquote profound psychological interconnections involving probable pasts and futures, dreams, telepathy, present abilities, suggestion, and related subjects. He also produces lines like, quote, as you sit reading this book in your present moment of time, you are positioned in the center of a cosmic web of probabilities that is affected by your slightest mental or emotional act, end quote. End of footnote. Hang on one second, though. The profound psychological interconnections involving probable pasts and futures, dreams, telepathy, present ability, suggestion, related subjects. And again, it just kind of reminds me of my dream, I guess. How strange and mysterious. The infant with whom he momentarily identified as the self he is now only underlined opaquely and indirectly shared common experience. This was not simple regression, then. Underlined, that child grew up in that probability, and Rupert grew up in this one. Pause. He touched upon certain coordinates that were neurologically shared, however, by both. He and the child were familiar with the carriage and the curb, the mother who pushed the carriage, and the house into which Rupert felt himself, as the child, being carried. He sensed the house interior and the stairway vividly. He knew that the mother then went down the stairs to bring in the carriage, but when he tried to perceive this, the motion became too fast. The mother's figure blurred so completely that he could not follow it. He felt confused and found himself entering the store around the corner, and then consciously circled the block and went into the school. Let's see how much longer this session is. All right, it's not too much longer. So I'm actually over my time limit here, but we might as well finish it. All right. The school and the store were not in the infant's experience, for in that probability the family moved away. The blur of activity earlier was the result of neurological confusion, and Rupert switched over unknowingly to an environment still in the same physical block that was meaningful to underlined him, but not shared by the future experience of that infant. You must understand that your own past exists as vitally as does your present, but your underlined probable past and presents exist in the same manner. You simply do not recognize them in the strands of experience that, quote unquote, you recognize. Footnote. A note added within the week. The specific exercise connected with the first practice element appears in the next 687th session. End of footnote. Okay, so give me just one moment to check on my plants. I mean, I was going to check on them by now anyway. If I have to extend this stream, then at least let me take a moment to check on my plants. I'll be right back. Okay, seems like they are doing well, getting plenty of light. Plenty of sunlight indeed, and I think I can leave the blinds open again for now. Let's just see what happens. Pause. Skip several spaces. As part of the work on this book, Rupert is just beginning to experiment with the conscious recognition of probable material and the conscious acceptance of kinds of experience usually tabooed according to the selectivity already mentioned. 1219. In the sleep state after our last session, then, he allowed his consciousness to expand enough so that it became aware of information and experience usually censored automatically through mental and neurological habit. In Adventures, Rupert uses the term prejudiced perception, an excellent one that is applicable here. For you have prejudiced yourself spiritually, mentally, and physically in those terms. In the sleep state, Rupert has become unprejudiced, at least to some degree, so that he encountered information that seemed alien or out of context with usual experience. Your theories of time underlined are connected with your usual neurological pulses. It is one thing to play with concepts of multidimensionality or probabilities, and quite another to be practically presented with them, even briefly, when your thought patterns and neurological habits tell you that they cannot be translated. So Rupert felt frustrated, and he told me in no uncertain terms, parentheses, see Appendix 4, that his consciousness could not contain the information he was receiving. Like a good teacher, parentheses, humorously, I took his protests into consideration. Later he wrote a statement that came to him. This was his conscious interpretation of the information he had received the night before, translated as best he could in linear terms. I have my own existence that is quite different from Rupert's, and yet I also have a reality that is connected to his psyche. Footnote. A note added later. We're still acquiring information about the psychic connections between Jane and Seth, of course. Even now, more than 10 years after Jane began speaking for Seth, one might say that each session we hold represents another step in this learning process. We fully expect it to continue as long as the sessions do. End of footnote. Each of you also have the same kind of connection with other, quote-unquote, more knowledgeable portions of yourself or your greater identity that are independently themselves and yet also alive in your psyches. They are portions of the, quote-unquote, unknown reality. Now I'm able to obtain information that Rupert, underlined in his terms, does not have. In other terms, he, underlined, does have it. And so do you, but you have been mentally, spiritually, and biologically prejudiced against it. As a race, you are ready to become more aware of your greater reality, however, and to explore its quote-unquote unknown aspects, period, hence this book. You may experience some irritability with some of the concepts in it simply because you have so schooled yourselves to ignore them. You should also experience an underlined acceleration of consciousness, however, and as you read it, a growing sense of familiarity. The framework of the book itself will lead you, if you allow it, into other strata of your own greater knowledge. Loudly, period, end of session. I will have some personal recommendations next time. Rupert's favorite television programs are good for him and allow his mind to rest. They are his mental play, and for that reason, important. 12:37 a.m. Good night, Seth. Thank you very much. Jane's trance had been very deep. Now she was bleary-eyed. I feel as though I don't want to think for 2 weeks. That was in quotes from Jane. Seth hadn't said so during the session, but Jane told me she'd, quote-unquote, picked up from him that she could eat an extra meal a day for a while, usually late at night, as, say, after a session. Also, she should take extra exercise each day, moving as rapidly as she could. She wasn't under any additional strain while producing unknown reality, she added, since she wanted to do it, but those simple actions would help refresh her. Her use of energy since starting the book has been lavish. Jane's comments before tonight's session about possible instructions from Seth are given in Appendix 5. After finishing Personal Reality in July 1973, Jane and I took quite a bit of time off from our usual Monday-Wednesday session routine while we prepared that book for publication. We developed the habit of watching certain television programs on Wednesday evening, but since we've gone back to holding sessions regularly, we haven't been able to see them. I suggested to Jane that we shift Wednesday night session to Thursday night. And once more, many times during the night after this session, Jane discovered herself involved with dictation for unknown reality, both in the sleep state and out of it. All right, so that concludes indeed this session. Next time it'll be session 687. Looks like it'll take 31 minutes approximately to read. And that'll be it for this stream. I'll most likely come back later in a couple of hours after I've had lunch and had some time to relax and focus myself. And at that time, I'll probably do some live tarot readings for donations. So we shall see how that goes. And I don't know if I really have a lot of energy. I might even present some more analysis of this Seth material tonight. So we'll just have to see. We shall just have to see. So I want to thank those for being here, who have been here, for being here. There weren't many people here this time, but that's okay. And also thanks to those who watch when this is not live. I'm going to go feast right now and then come back for more. Other than that, remember, as long as we don't have any more inconvenient storms or anything, I'll be back on Wednesday doing more live tarot readings. Probably also do some kind of special stream that day. Then back on Saturday for the At Long Last Four of Wands analysis stream that we didn't get to do. Then back on Monday, as always, with more Seth streams. So, all right. So thanks again for watching and have a great night. See you soon. Bye for now.